about plankton and look at this in the context of ecosystem productivity. So we'll get back to talking about ecosystems and even get back into talking about currents and things. And you can see where some of the things that we talked about in the early part of the course start coming into play, start becoming useful for practical understanding. So when ecologists talk about productivity, what they mean is the amount of living tissue, the amount of biomass produced per unit time. Primary productivity is productivity that's due to photosynthesis. And we often express this as grams of fixed carbon, i.e., if you took a certain amount of photosynthetic things, shone light on them, how much carbon dioxide would they suck out of the atmosphere and convert into biomass, into sugars and carbohydrates and lipids and nucleic acids and all of that stuff. And we often express this as grams of fixed carbon per unit area per unit time. So for example, if you look down at the bottom, tropical rainforests, the productivity is 2,200 grams. That's roughly 5 pounds per square meter per year. So take 1 square meter, that's what, roughly maybe 8 square feet of tropical rainforest. Watch it for an entire year, and you'll have almost 5 pounds of living material on it that you didn't have when you started, if that makes any sense at all. For grasslands, it's less than a quarter of that, 500 grams per square meter per year. And you can see that the ocean varies. The open ocean is not very productive. That's only 125 grams per square meter per year. Shallower ocean on the continental shelf is much more productive. Reefs and beds of algae and seagrass beds can exceed tropical rainforest in the amount of productivity, the amount of biomass that they create. And estuaries, that's regions around where rivers meet the ocean, often very productive. South Louisiana is basically one great big bunch of estuaries, and we get a lot of fish and seafood out of them, and they're also extremely productive. Now, you need sunlight to do photosynthesis, duh. You need carbon dioxide, and that's pretty much everywhere, but to carry it out, you need some nutrients as well. You've got to have nitrogen. That's required for protein synthesis. You can't make amino groups without nitrogen. And you can't make nucleic acids without it either. You need nitrogen to make your nucleic acid bases. You need phosphorus. That's required to produce ATP and, nucleic acids and things. Enzymes that are involved in photosynthesis and in nitrogen fixation require iron as a cofactor. You might remember that a lot of enzymes don't work right unless you can add an atom of iron or magnesium or copper or zinc or something like that. And then diatoms need silicon. You might recall diatoms are those very symmetrical single-celled algae in which the cell is contained in a casing called a test that is made of silica. Diatoms are so good at extracting silica out of the water that I'm told if you grow a bunch of them in a glass beaker and give them plenty of light and everything, they'll start taking silicon out of the walls of the beaker. Your glassware will actually get thinner if you use it to grow diatoms. Very efficient at sucking out silicon. And you have to have those if you're going to have photosynthesis. And the source for them is kind of odd. Earlier this summer, there were some places on the east coast of the U.S. that had rather hazy skies, and the news was it was dust blowing across the Atlantic. That actually happens naturally. The main source of usable iron in the open oceans is wind-blown dust from the land. And here you have dust getting blown off the Sahara Desert. That's the coast of Africa to the right. You can see making this dust plume that must be 1,000 miles long, settling down in the ocean. That's a major source of iron that's available for photosynthesis in the oceans. Wow. You also get nutrients coming from the land into the ocean via rivers. There you've got the Gulf Coast. You can see New Orleans is marked. You can see my house from there. My house is probably just a little bit to the left of the A in the word Atchafalaya. That's where I'm from. And in the coastline, you can see why Louisiana doesn't have awful lot of beaches. You can see some nice beaches over to the right of the word New Orleans. You start getting into the Mississippi and Alabama Gulf coasts. Louisiana's full of rivers, the big one being the Mississippi, and to the west of it, the Atchafalaya. And there's a bunch of other smaller ones like the Sabine River and Bayou Lafourche and all that. And as they erode the land, they transport material. They transport a lot of silt, right? A lot of very fine mud, fine sediment. They transport that into the oceans, but they transport dissolved stuff as well. And they transport dead organic material. And as that runs off into the ocean, that's a major transport mechanism for getting things like nitrogen and phosphorus into the rivers. That's not universally beneficial from a human standpoint. Higher up on the Mississippi River, where we grow all of our corn, people put lots of fertilizer on their cornfields. And the excess fertilizer tends to wash off the land and wash into ditches, which drain into creeks, which drain into rivers, which drain into bigger rivers, which ultimately drain into the Mississippi. And between that and things like sewage and stuff like that, you get these days this huge nutrient input into the Gulf of Mexico that creates enormous blooms of algae. They live, they die, and as they die, they sink to the bottom and decay. And decay is a process that consumes oxygen. So that creates a zone in the Gulf of Mexico down on the bottom with a minimal oxygen level. So you have this area of nearly anoxic water on the bottom called the dead zone. And its size comes and goes, but it's not really something that you'd want to get any bigger, especially when you consider that it's right next to some of the most productive seafood areas in the country. Right. So anyway, so nitrogen and other nutrients run off through rivers, and this may be quite seasonal. What you're looking at here is a map of the Gulf of Maine, or 6 maps of the Gulf of Maine. The land is all in white. If you look at one of the maps, right between 41 and 42 north latitude, that little hook that's sticking out is Cape Cod, Massachusetts. The city of Boston is right about at 42. And then coming up north from there, you've got the coast of Maine going on to the coast of Canada. So you've got the coast of, Newfoundland and Nova Scotia up there at the right of each map. And these are satellite pictures, and the colorful areas are color-coded for the intensity of chlorophyll. You can actually put instruments on a satellite that will measure the intensity of the specific colors of light that are getting reflected by chlorophyll. And so you can measure primary productivity from on high. And you can see in January, most of that area is pretty low. You see a lot of blue. It starts getting a bit greener in February, and then March, and especially in April, boom, we've got this crazy amount of productivity, lots and lots and lots of algae, and it finally starts fading away by about June. The reason for that is up north, you have snow. You might have heard of it. It's the white fluffy stuff that falls out of the sky in ancient legends. You have snow, and of course the snow melts, typically starting around March, and as it melts, it flows into creeks, or I think it's cricks up there, which flow into rivers, which flow into the ocean, and you get this springtime swelling of rivers. Otherwise very small rivers suddenly get larger. Lots of fresh water is released by the snowmelt, and it floods into the ocean, and it carries soil, and it carries dead organic matter, and it carries dissolved substances with it. And that gives you this seasonal boost of nutrients into the Gulf of Maine. And as you can see, it peaks in April, and it's going pretty well in March through May. That swelling of rivers from melting snow, by the way, is called a freshet, which is a lovely word that, I don't know, I just think it's a cool word. Freshet. Sounds like what it's describing. Imagine it's spring and everything feels fresh. Right, enough with the poetry. There's plenty of nitrogen in the atmosphere as well, but N2 is chemically a tough nut to crack. Those nitrogen atoms stick to each other very strongly, and it's not straightforward to convert them into a soluble form that living things can use. That's called nitrogen fixation. That's one of the things that Dr. Mukherjee studies in his lab, if you know him. And on land, there are bacteria that can do this trick, and bacteria in particular that are symbiotic in the roots of certain plants, as well as living freely in the soil. In aquatic and oceanic ecosystems, it's the blue-green bacteria that are best at this, and in particular, a blue-green bacterium called trichodesmium, shown here, is a major nitrogen fixer. And it can be so abundant that you can see blooms of it in the open sea. These are a couple of islands in, I think that's out in the Atlantic. Tana and Lifu are the islands, and then in between the two, you can see that area that looks a little greenish and swirly, labeled trichodesmium bloom. Trichodesmium is so abundant that you can get blooms of it in the open sea, and it's affectionately known as sea straw. Okay, so in the open ocean, you have plankton living, and they live high up in the water column, photosynthesizing, and then zooplankton eat the phytoplankton. Everything lives, everything poops, and everything dies. Yeah, that's like a profound truth about the nature of life right there. And plankton are no exception, and they live, poop, die, rot, and there's nowhere to go but down. So dead plankton and plankton poop, as they decay, slowly rain down into the deep ocean, glued together in clumps with dead mucus and with something called transparent exopolymer, which is a polysaccharide, like a starch, that diatoms in particular happen to make. And the resulting mess is called marine snow. This is what it looks like. This is a picture taken in the deep ocean in a powerful light beam. And you can see, I mean, it looks like snow seen, if you've ever driven in a snowstorm, it looks exactly like that. And this marine snow is constantly raining into the deep ocean. It's ultimately the base of the food web for critters living in the deep ocean. They are almost all of them, with a spectacular exception, dependent on that primary productivity raining down from on high. Okay, so what happens there? Well, things in the biosphere tend not to stay put. So if that was the end of the story, then the deep ocean would just get richer and richer, more and more enriched in marine snow. But all of those nutrients don't stay there in the bottom. There's a satellite picture of, this is mostly South America that you're looking at. Up at the top, you can see Panama and a bit of Central America, Costa Rica and Nicaragua and all that. And again, the land is shown in black because the land is not very interesting. And what you're looking at is concentrations of phosphate, critical nutrient for photosynthesis, well, for everybody. And you'll notice that, the Atlantic is pretty low in phosphate in most places, except for a couple of, they look like little bumps on the north coast of South America that are kind of greenish. That's where rivers are flowing in. But if you look over on the Pacific side to the left, there's a hugely rich zone with lots and lots of phosphorus right next to the South American coast, more or less along the coast of Peru is where that is, that red, even shading to pink zone. So there is this plume of very nutrient-rich water right off the coast of Peru. And that's due to a phenomenon called upwelling. Right at Peru, you have a current, right? It's part of one of those gyres that we talked about. It's called the South Pacific Gyre that is coming north along the coast of South America and then breaking right at the equator. You see where the equator is, right? It's that 0 degrees over at the left. That's where the equator is. And that South Pacific Gyre is going around counterclockwise because it's in the southern hemisphere. And it's going along the South American coast and then pulling away from shore. Well, when a current pulls away from shore, it doesn't leave a hole in the ocean, right? Fluids have this criterion of continuity, meaning you can't dig a hole in them. So if water is getting pushed away from somewhere, water has to flow in to replace it. And what's happening is that deep ocean water is getting dragged to the surface, where that surface current is coming along the shore and then pulling away. That's upwelling. There are certain zones where you have a gyre running alongside a continent and then moving away from it, where this deep, nutrient-rich ocean water gets pulled into the surface waters, gets pulled up to the surface, and those include some of the richest fisheries on the planet. Peru has a very active fishing industry. Incidentally, I didn't think to put a slide up about this, but so you know, for reasons I don't think we fully understand, that South Pacific Gyre has a way of weakening every so often, every few years. Now and again, you'll have about a year where that gyre doesn't flow very strongly. When that gyre isn't flowing, the upwelling slacks off, and there's not nearly as much nutrients in the water without that upwelling. When there's no nutrients in the water, one of the things you get is funky weather patterns when that circulation slows down, but you also get a really bad year for fishing. There may be starvation among seabirds and things like that that depend on the small fish that live in this water and depend on eating the algae. So you get a temporary breakdown in the ecosystem. You can have mass death of seabirds and marine mammals and things like that, and you have a pretty rough year for the fishermen. The fishermen usually see signs that this is happening right about the time of Christmas. So it shows up right about the same time that the baby Jesus shows up in the manger. So they name this phenomenon after the baby Jesus, or in Spanish, the child, El Niño. That's a term you might have heard. El Niño means the Christ child. Well, it means the child, but the child in question is the Christ child. So there. So when winds blow along a coastline, they'll push water in that direction. But because of the Coriolis effect, the water will bend away from the coastline in the direction that you'd predict. Because this is in the southern hemisphere, that current that's flowing along the South American coastline is bending to its own left and flowing away from the coastline at an angle. And that phenomenon, by the way, is called Ekman transport, after the guy that worked it out. And if water is getting pushed away from the coast by Ekman transport, deep water gets sucked upwards, bringing these nutrients that have been locked in the deep sea into the shallows, where they can nourish the growth of algae, which feed baby fish and zooplankton and so on. This is the same thing. That's the coast of South Africa. That is another upwelling zone. And for some reason, they made red to represent cold water, and the blues and greens are warm water. I don't know why. But what you can see is that at St. Helen Bay in South Africa, there's a plume of unusually cold water. That's that deep, cold bottom water getting pulled up by surface currents. And South Africa also has a very rich fisheries, as does the country of Namibia, just north of it. Which is part of the reason why back in the 70s, South America was fighting a really nasty war to try to control Namibia. Part of the reason anybody would want it is because there's pretty rich fishing opportunities just off the coast. You can also get seasonal upwelling, where you have winds that push surface water away from a coastline. Now, in tropical areas, Kessia, you probably know a lot about this, probably more than I do. In tropical areas, the seasonal alteration is often not so much cold versus hot, winter versus summer, as it is dry versus rainy. And you'll have part of the year where you don't get a great deal of rain, and part of the year where it gets very wet indeed. And this is correlated with shifts in the prevailing wind direction. What you're looking at here is, to the left, that's Africa. More or less in the center, you've got Saudi Arabia, Iran, Pakistan, and India. You can see India is that kind of triangular-shaped projection sticking into the Indian Ocean, with the island of Sri Lanka next to it. Cutting over all the way to, I guess that's Thailand, over on the right. And this is another color-coded satellite picture of algal growth. And you can see there's not a great deal going on. Purples and blues are the least. Reds and oranges are the most. And you see there's not an awful lot going on in April and June. In July, August, and September, boom, you can see things just heated up quite a bit. What's going on here is that prevailing winds in the summer blow from land onto the ocean, what they do is push surface currents away from the coastline. That creates seasonal upwelling. So you get this temporary surge of upwelling when water is pushed away from the land. Deep water is pulled up to replace it. So you go from that to that. And that means that seasonal fishing is very good. I should mention that fairly close to the center, that kind of triangle-shaped projection off of Africa, that's Somalia. And Somalia's central government collapsed. They haven't had a great deal of success in rebuilding what's been a very shattered country for a long time. With Somalia no longer having an effective central government or much in the way of a navy or a coast guard, fishing vessels from other countries moved into Somali waters and started basically vacuuming all of the fish out of the ocean. This was a problem because the fishermen of Somalia had, well, made their living going fishing. You can catch quite a lot of fish in the right season because of this seasonal upwelling pattern. Once their fish stocks were exploited by other countries because Somalia didn't have a way of defending its own waters, some of those fishermen had no choice to support their families except to turn into pirates. So if you heard about, you don't hear about it being as much of a problem, but you might remember news stories from several years back about Somali pirates hijacking vessels in the Indian Ocean and holding them for ransom. This is why that was going on. It was fishermen that no longer had many fish to catch because they didn't have any protection. Their fish stocks were depleted and they couldn't take advantage of the seasonal upwelling pattern. So yeah, it's all connected. The other place where you'll get upwelling is you might have a deep water current that gets pushed up into the shallows by a physical obstacle. When I was in Boston, you should do this. The New England Aquarium runs these whale watching tours, and about an hour sail outside of Boston, there is a zone where you have unusually shallow water. You go from several thousand feet depth to only about 600 feet or so. And I'll think of the name of this place probably about 2 minutes after logging off. But what goes on is because you have a deep water current that gets pushed into the shallows because it has to go up and over this obstacle, you have a pocket with lots of productivity, and it draws lots of fish. It feeds lots of bottom-dwelling fish, notably a type of eel called the sand lance, and those support a large population of humpback whales. So there's terrific whaling to be seen. We got to see several humpbacks and a mink whale going out to these banks just outside of Boston. So if you go, you need to do this. It's really cool. They refund your money if you don't see whales, but they almost never have to. It's a very productive spot. Something similar happens in the Grand Banks off of Newfoundland, which is where the band that you heard is from. They're called Great Big Sea. And over the Grand Banks of Newfoundland, you get mixing between the warm water Gulf Stream and a colder water going in the other direction called the Labrador Current. And in the shallows over the Grand Banks, deep water gets pulled upwards into the shallows, and you get nasty weather, lots of fogs, lots of rain, and lots of productivity. The Grand Banks were, until recently, some of the richest fishing grounds in the world. Okay, so there's a map of primary productivity globally, and you should be able to spot that those purple areas, that's the centers of those gyres, And you can see they're pretty much deserts. There's not a great deal of nutrients flowing in because they're not close to rivers. They're not on upwelling zones, so there's not actually a lot of productivity there. The hotspots you can see are close to the coast. Some of them are close to the mouths of major rivers. The Amazon River, I can see, has a pretty big spot. The Yangtze in China, I can see a spot due to, you can see some in the Gulf of Mexico. But you can also see the zones of upwelling. You can see that one off of Peru. You can see upwelling off of South Africa. There's an upwelling zone off the coast of California. So you can see where primary productivity is going on. Some areas are very productive, and some aren't. We talked about food webs showing trophic relationships, which means who is eating what. So you can see a food web where down at the bottom, of course, we have the primary producers of dinoflagellates and diatoms. Those get fed on by zooplankton, shrimp and copepods and pteropods, if you remember those. Those get fed on by larger crustaceans and filter-feeding fish like a lanternfish and molas. That thing that looks like an amputated fish head is in fact a complete fish. It's called mola, the ocean sunfish. And then those get fed on by larger fish with, jaws up there at the very top of the food web. You can simplify these to food chains. It's a simplification because some organisms might be feeding on more than one. The shark eating smaller sharks, but also eating mackerel and maybe also eating ocean sunfish. But if you simplify a bit, you can talk about a food chain that has different levels. The biomass of phytoplankton you can represent by, we'll call it B. Efficiency is basically what percentage of biomass at one level makes it into the next level. And very roughly, it's about 10%, 0.1. This can vary a bit depending on what organisms you've got, but 10% is a good rule of thumb. Some food chains have more links and some have fewer. We can call that number N. And then if we assume that the fish that you might want to catch are the ones up at the top of the food chain, we can call that P. And so the production of food fish at any given spot is going to be equal to the biomass of the phytoplankton, how much phytoplankton you've got, multiplied by the efficiency, which is going to be roughly 0.1, to the power of the number of links in the food chain. So you can use this to try to estimate, how much food fish any given part of the ocean can produce. It was estimated in 1972 that the potential global annual fisheries yield in the ocean was 100 million tons. We've been exceeding this ever since 2000, which simply put is not sustainable. We are taking more from the ocean than the ocean can continue to supply. I'll talk about that a little bit later, but that's a threat to long-term societal sustainability. And you have, hello cat. Sorry, I've got a cat on me. Hey, cat, not hair. You can talk about food webs in the ocean as belonging to three different types. Way out in the blue water, way out in the open ocean, food webs tend to have the lowest productivity, as low as 50 grams of carbon per square meter per year, but they may have the highest number of levels, typically 5, sometimes as many as 9. You're seeing that on the left-hand side of this diagram, where the small algae get fed on by small herbivores, eaten by small predators, by large predators, by fish. Closer to the coast, you may have only 3 levels, but higher productivity. And then in upwelling zones, you might only have 2 levels, but you have the highest productivity of all. And what controls what goes on in food webs is either control from the bottom up or control from the top down. Bottom up control is caused by changes in phytoplankton. An example would be what happens at El Nino when that upwelling weakens. What you get is cutoff of the nutrients. The plankton can't grow nearly as much, and that has effects all through the food web. If the plankton can't grow, then the zooplankton can't grow, and the sardines can't grow, and the fishermen can't grow. So that's control from the bottom up. Top-down control is changes in the apex predators that have effects down the chain, effects called a trophic cascade. Great example of this. There's the Atlantic cod, Gadus morhua, a very large, tasty, and highly nutritious fish that used to swarm in enormous numbers off the Grand Banks of Newfoundland. Especially when people figured out how to dry it and salt it. This was one of the cheapest sources of protein that Europeans had access to. And the Atlantic cod, is not that close to Europe, but as soon as the New World discovered it, there have been European ships fishing the Newfoundland Grand Banks and catching cod ever since the 1500s. Cod is a major part of the cuisine. If you go to eat traditional New England cuisine, you're going to get an awful lot of cod. And through the years, fishermen did what economic theory says that they ought to do, right? You get a small boat, you go out and fish your cod. If everything works and you don't die horribly in a storm, you save your money and eventually you buy a bigger boat. Well, the bigger boat lets you catch more cod, so you make more money. And if everything goes well, you eventually have enough money to buy an even bigger boat. Or maybe you buy a second boat and hire somebody to fish for you. So as long as everything goes well, fishermen will buy bigger boats, more boats. As the technology improves, they start buying technology as well. The first big one was refrigerated holds, which mean that you don't have to catch cod during the day and then sail home. You can stay out at sea for weeks and go out farther and exploit cod sources that you couldn't before. In the aftermath of World War II, sonar came on the market, which enables you to find fish. Sonar can be used to find schools of fish. Shoot, they sell this for bass fishing in lakes. And then ultimately, the end game is things like this. This is a Russian factory ship that can process hundreds of tons of fish each day. So every day you can catch hundreds of tons of fish and basically turn them into McDonald's Filet-O-Fish sandwiches right then and there. And in 1505, there were an estimated 7 million tons of Atlantic cod. In 1992, the government of Canada shut down the Atlantic cod fishery because their stocks were down to 1/3% of that level. And you can see what happened. The catch size grows slowly between 1850 and about 1960. It takes a big spike. That's right about when sonar becomes available, and the Canadian government is encouraging exploitation of this bountiful resource. It crashes in the 70s, recovers a little bit in the 80s, and then in the 90s it crashes again. The fishery that had been used by humans since the 1500s had to be shut down because there just weren't any more fish in the ocean. Well, there were a few, but there was concern that the fishery might never recover at all if they didn't shut it down. That destroyed an entire way of life in Newfoundland. There were communities that depended on fishing that had to abandon their livelihood, and fishermen who didn't know how to do anything else suddenly had to find jobs doing something else, and it created a great deal of social trauma in Newfoundland. Created an economic hit that they still haven't entirely recovered from. Okay, cod used to be the top predators. Now that we've pretty much removed the cod, what the fishermen that have stayed in the business have switched to doing, and not all of them did it because you have to learn new techniques and get different equipment, but the fishermen have switched to going after what the cod used to be feeding on, which is small fish, and especially crabs and shrimp. So if you wipe out the top level of the local food chain, you may have to fish on the next higher level. This is called fishing down the food chain. So now that we've taken out the cod, fishermen have been going for the shrimp. And I guess if we ever fish all the shrimp out, we'll start eating large-bodied zooplankton or something. The good news, I guess, is that after 25 years of no cod fishing at all, some of the populations have recovered a bit, enough to allow some limited fishing. They took 13,000 tons of cod in 2017. Certainly the Canadian government is monitoring this to try to make sure that the stock is fished sustainably. Unfortunately, the cod, as they're coming back, are starting to eat lots of shrimp. And the fishermen that had switched over to shrimp are now finding that they're not getting nearly as much shrimp because the cod are eating them. So shrimp stocks are down to almost an eighth of what they were just 10 years ago. So this is why you have to manage fisheries carefully. It's not really good if you have to keep adjusting your strategy and retooling your boats every few years to try to catch a new crop after the old one has been overexploited. So there. So all of that stuff I was talking about currents and gyres and things like that, has very direct effect on the world food supply and even on what you might have for dinner. So I will now stop recording.